So I'm going to kick things off. My name is Simeon Brown. I am a correspondent on Channel 4 News. I do a lot of work at the moment looking at artificial intelligence on our news strands AI Watch, which is trying to make sense of a major disruption that is taking place that we're all interested in at the moment. There's so many headlines, some of it hype, some of it over-exaggerated, but also some of it very, 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 very much real. And what we're trying to do is really make sense of it for our audience, as well as trying to humanize the disruption that is taking place. Tech can be quite a sturgid and technical area, but fundamentally it impacts human beings. And so that is really the entry point into making sense of it for us. In terms of, in this session, we have brought together some of the finest minds that you can find on artificial intelligence and journalism. We have seen major disruption with AI, across the creative sector, in film, in TV, and now in journalism. And so I bring to you, a real kind of like stand-up group. We have Tammy Hoffman, who is from ITN. She's one of our own. We have Ali Abbas Ali from Ofcom, who is the director of broadcasting competition. And we also have Gary Rogers, who is an experienced journalist, but is also a tech pioneer in AI and using it to do journalism. So in terms of disruption, he's very much at the heart and the front line of that too. So before we kind of get into it, one of the things that I've noticed with artificial intelligence is fundamentally that as much as it's describing a genre of software, it is also primarily a kind of marketing term as well. And PRs have been very much aware that it can generate a lot of headlines. And so we've seen things that we have not considered AI now being reframed as AI because it generates more headlines. So the definition of it is still one thing that there is considerable debate around. What I want to ask our panel first and foremost is, how do you define artificial intelligence? What do you consider it to be? And I want to start off with Tammy. How does ITN define AI?
We've got a formal definition, which is AI is a collection of technologies that create systems capable of performing tasks that would normally require human intelligence. So that's our party line on what it is. But I would very much agree with you that, we've all been using AI for many, many years. I mean, anyone who's got a phone, anyone who kind of sorts their photos to get all their cat pics in one place, you're using AI. I think really where we are looking and thinking at the moment is around generative AI. And I think it's quite important to differentiate between the two things.
Right. Gary?
I would agree with Tammy's broad definition. I think that's a good starting place. Within that, in a more technical sense, you have a field of what's called narrow AI, which is to build something which does a particular function which you've trained it to do. And then you have the more scary general AI, where you have the idea that something can learn, understand, build knowledge, and go off and solve problems all on its own. General AI doesn't actually exist yet. And most of the howl round currently is that the development of generative AI has taken us a step closer to it. And the concern that it takes us on that road, which experts dispute. Some say it does, some say it doesn't. And I think your first assertion, everything is now AI, is broadly true. There's a lot of marketing hype around it. In journalism terms, I would define it as things that also include automating processes of taking manual tasks away and getting a machine to do them. So that's broadly how I would think of it in its application.
Great, thanks a lot, Gary. And Ali?
In fairness, I think Gary and Tammy have pretty much covered it. I think where I'd probably just add a little color to that is when we're talking about generative AI, we're broadly referring to algorithms that can create new content in response to a prompt. So you can ask it a question, it'll generate something, it'll create something for you, and that could be text, images, audio, video, or even code. And I guess the strength, but also the limitation, is that content closely resembles the content on which the generative AI model that you're using has been trained. So there is an input limitation or an input strength of that generative AI.
And are there any particular genres of AI that Ofcom are looking at and are really, really concerned about and are introducing guidelines around?
Well, to be frank, AI has multiple touch points across all of our regulatory duties, and there's opportunities and risks we're keeping an eye on from pretty much every team in Ofcom. So let me give you some examples. Really interesting, powerful uses of synthetic data for training safety technology, where you might not want to use real data, or real data may be limited. There's ways of editing content now for different audiences, which could be really powerful. We're also looking at the use of AI in our own regulatory work. So many of the people listening in today will respond to Ofcom consultations. And there could be a role for AI in summarizing and categorizing those responses.
What do you mean editing content for different audiences? How? Yeah, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there may be, for example, if you've got a particular video stream, you've got a set of content, and you're trying to identify within that content that may be harmful, or pre and post watershed and that kind of thing. Your ability to extract that content, take it out for one audience, leave it in for another. The AI tools will help you do that and merge the videos back in a seamless way. So they're really powerful. It's one example, but it's really powerful ways of doing that, which will help with compliance for those people who are broadcasting content.
Great. And Tammy, how are ITN already kind of integrating the use of AI, and especially generative AI, if at all?
Well, I mean, I think when you've got a building full of journalists, and journalists are naturally curious people, the chances that we don't have people in our building using generative AI to play around and see how they can better do their jobs would be ridiculous. So what we're actually trying to do at ITN is accept that this is a really exciting new technology, that it's going to have applications, that it's going to have uses, but try to sort of divide that up between what we're doing in an experimental way and what we're actually doing in our sort of live journalism, where frankly, for the moment, we really want to ring fence and safeguard. So for example, we've got some of our commercial teams, one of our teams who do educational videos, where it's, it's high volume videos. And there we're playing around with things like DALL-E for creating images that we don't have stock shot images for, of using AI to create scripts that are specific to different educational learning levels or tailored to particular countries. And also just on the actual editing side of it, things like captioning, subtitling, changing it into different languages. There are loads of tools out there. I think what we're really keen to do is, as I say, experiment in some of the non-journalistic frontline bits of what we do. And then the really tricky bit is then creating ways that we feed that knowledge back in, that we look at it carefully, consider it, and then feed it back into our newsrooms. So yeah, it's around identifying bits of the business and then having good communication structures and good checking structures so that we can collate those learnings and then work out where we want to disseminate them.
So in the use of the software that could create kind of stock images that don't exist, there are obvious kind of concerns around that. I mean, recently I was at a conference that was about open internet use, and they were expressing dissatisfaction at Amnesty's use of AI images on a report into protests in Colombia, and the image obviously was not of an event that actually happened, and they felt that they were concerned about this front line basically of organizations who are supposed to be reflecting the world now being a part of generating images which have been created and they're not a reflection. I mean, what policies does ITN have, or will we be developing, to kind of ensure that fundamentally everybody can still trust what it is that we're doing, and to ensure that, fundamentally generative AI doesn't compromise the standards that we currently have?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think it's a massive issue. I think, first of all, there's a legal issue. So, for example, we are talking to companies that create stock images, like, for instance, without wanting to plug them, but, Shutterstock have just created an AI tool for generating images where it's DALL-E software, but it's DALL-E software that has only been trained on their images. And therefore, we are kind of comfortable with owning the intellectual property that's created. They can actually indemnify us and we can indemnify our clients. So I think there's that side of it to make sure that we are not ripping off creators by using content that they haven't licensed for AI learning. So there's that side of it. I think that in terms of creating images which kind of warp reality, it's a really tricky one, because if you think about it, graphics for many years have been creating images that are not necessarily real. The difference is that whereas before, if you wanted to create a shot of Trump shaking hands with Putin, you needed to be a pretty talented graphic designer to do that. What generative AI is doing is putting these really powerful tools into essentially the hands of amateurs. So you don't need to be a graphic designer. You don't need that skill set to create something which could look convincing. So where is the line? I think, and certainly in the guidelines that we're giving staff, we are talking about context, and we're talking about how it impacts on the audience. So anything where the image would be misleading the audience to, lead them to think that it was a real thing that isn't, that's where we think it needs to be labeled. And I would equate it to how, for example, we already use things like library pictures. If Prince Harry is arriving at court and he hasn't arrived yet, and so we show him arriving from a week ago, well, you would expect us as a reputable news organisation to have a date up there, either of the date he arrived or the fact it's library pictures. Or if we were to use a reconstruction, say, in a piece about a crime story, you would expect us to have the words reconstruction up there so that viewers didn't think that this was the real telling of the event. And that's how we see AI. That if our graphic teams, for whatever reason, feel that it's useful to use AI imagery to create something that they don't already have, that needs to be really clearly labeled so that the audience is in no doubt of the fact this is created or synthetic rather than a depiction of real events.
I mean, obviously the opportunities are clear, but the risks are also very, very stark. I mean, Ali, from a regulatory perspective, I mean, we can see where some of those concerns are. I mean, at what point would Ofcom, intervene in some of these things, in some of the uses of these softwares?
So first of all, just to put a boundary on this, our role with regard to print media is really limited to ownership and merger. So what we're talking about from an Ofcom perspective, when we're looking at standards, really, it's just the broadcaster. So just to be clear for everyone, that's the domain. And to be frank, in the first instance, the onus has to be on the newsroom. If you hold a broadcast license, you have an ongoing responsibility to comply with the broadcasting code. And we expect you to protect audiences from harm and maintain high levels of trust in broadcast news. Those are the rules of the game. So what we're looking at is to say, well, the rules are still there. The broadcasting code still applies if you're using AI. And in complete fairness to Tammy, I think she's outlined some really good sort of controls and procedures that ITN has in place. We are looking for you to absolutely unleash the creativity and efficiency of AI, but do it in a really responsible way. And that means investing in the people who understand how the tools work, or, as Tammy mentioned with regard to Shutterstock, make sure that you've got bulletproof contracts and controls in place with your suppliers for how that content comes together. Because ultimately, as the broadcaster, you're liable, and that control hasn't changed whether or not you use AI.
Great. And Gary, I mean, you are already using AI quite significantly in the process of news gathering. For people who are not familiar with your work, can you just outline what it is that your company does and what it's doing?
I suppose I date from a pre-generative AI, which now seems some of the historic phase of AI development. So I got interested in the space back in about 2016 as an add-on to some data journalism projects I was doing. I was looking at a way to be able to write lots and lots and lots of local news, data-driven stories, and there was more data than I could I could get a team of people to write. So I had to try and find a solution. The solution was a technology called natural language generation, or NLG, which at the time was considered to be quite cutting edge in the AI space, and now seems quite tame in comparison to what's followed on. That grew into a business called Radar, which is now operated by the PA and generates about 150,000 stories of local data journalism every year for clients around the country. So there are very good, well-trusted tools out there and very useful practical applications for using AI tools to do jobs that journalists can't do by human effort alone. And if you think about a framing which is AI as an assistant, not a replacement to journalism, I think you start in a better place. To try to think of an area of activity that you can't do, to think of an audience you can't serve, and look at whether there is some sort of machine route to augment what your journalists do to be able to serve those audiences. And I think people who start in that space, rather than we'll get AI to do it all now, are a much better place to be successful at this. And my current work has been involved in working with newsrooms to look at where they use those tools and where they now look at opportunities to use generative AI tools as well, if indeed they should, as Tammy has already voiced. And there's a lot of appetite, but a lot of concern about where on earth do you start? Finding the starting point is always the difficult one, and knowing how heavily to bet on this horse or not. Is AI going to be the fundamental disruptive thing to journalism in the way that the advent of the internet in the early 90s disrupted journalism significantly, and the advent of social media, in 2008, 2009, further disrupted media? Is this one of those key disruptive moments that you need to get ahead of? Can you afford to do something? Can you afford not to do something? That's the strategic decision for news businesses at the moment.
And do you think it is?
I think it's potentially very disruptive. Because I think what fundamentally this does is it takes a set of creative tools and makes them more widely available. Tammy referred to this earlier about graphic designers always being able to use Photoshop or something to create an image. With the tools now currently available, more people can do that. So more people can do that within a news business, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. But also there's a potential for more people to be creators. And there's a potential for more people to almost self-serve themselves news if they have access to a database to craft the news in the way they want it, using a generative tool to do so. So that would be very disruptive, because it means the news company potentially is not the final deliverer of a product. They're the deliverer of information, and you make your own product using the tools that you've already got built into your desktop or your mobile phone at home. So that's potentially very disruptive if you look further out.
And I guess, graphics is an interesting one, because obviously graphics have always had a particular grammar where people know they're looking at graphics.
Yeah.
With generative AI, especially kind of around imagery, now that process of differentiation is far harder. And even if somebody who is watching the news sees a strap on it, it's very easy in this age of kind of meme aggregators where people get their news from Shadeborough or meme pages or whatever, where basically that caption or even the news brand gets clipped out and it gets reframed for their platform. And suddenly now we're potentially in a space where if you create an image which looks so real, we then become complicit potentially in generating misinformation, and that becomes the space that we don't want to be in. And what are some of the extra precautions that we would need to take in this kind of space, do you imagine? And that's open to Ali, Tammy, that's open.
Well, I think a massive piece of this is about educating our staff. I think it's interesting because really it's about all of the editorial guidelines that we've already had in place for many, many years, but squared. You know, they are more important now than they've ever been. So things like, you know, verifying stuff that you see on social media, that obviously has always been something that we've encouraged our journalists to do. But the verification now needs to be so much better, and frankly needs to be applied far more widely, because I think that the bar for what you believe has got to be, I can't work out whether it's raised or lowered, but what I'm saying is you need to be really, really skeptical. And actually, I suppose this is the bit where I do have some faith that journalism and, you know, editors really still have a very, very vital role to play in newsrooms, because actually having a news antenna is never going to be more important. You know, that anything that just doesn't quite look right, that you question it and you go back and you double check the pictures and you try and verify it with other sources. You know, we've always been asking staff to do it. We just need them to do it so much more. So a lot of that is about educating, because if we're not going to become part of the problem, we've got to differentiate ourselves. So educating staff about how how easy it is to create stuff that's misleading. You know, we haven't even touched yet on things like the biases in AI, the hallucinations in AI, the false results. As organizations, we've got to start building this into our protocols, our training manuals, and our procedures, because as Ali says, it's really important that staff realize that the responsibility for their output is still with them. They're responsible for their output, and ITN is ultimately liable for their output as well. So we really need to step up as managers and leaders.
Can I add to that? I think Tammy's right, but I think I'm quite optimistic about some of this, because I think journalists are quite good at this stuff and have been for a number of years. But if I talk to open source intelligence teams who spend a lot of time filtering disinformation, they're ready for this challenge. They're slightly daunted that there might be a lot more of it, but they're ready for this challenge, and they have techniques and tools they use which are reliable, and so they can do this job. There's a way, an opportunity for news companies here, that if it becomes more difficult to discern what's true and what's not, then people need to turn to trusted brands, and they will turn to people who they can rely on, and they will return to big broadcasters, big news brands. And so this is an opportunity to further your reputation of trust and win some things back. Having said that, the other area, however, is, and should those news companies also use these tools to produce things?
Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it?
Well, the example you gave of the idea of a generated image and labeling. Now, transparency and labeling is vitally important to make sure that relationship of trust is maintained. However, there's an interesting principled question for news organizations to answer, each individually according to the context of their audience and their relationship with that audience, is, should we ever use a generated image? There's an example from a few months back where a Norwegian publication, a very good Norwegian publication, ran a story about energy, and on its website, and it used a generated image of pylons across a snowy field. It got a lot of complaints about that. It told people it was a generated image, but people complained that a fantasy image had no place in news output, and it replaced that image with a stock image of pylons across a snowfield. And perhaps people aren't comfortable yet, but the context is very important here as to how to make those judgments, and difficult currently in this developing world of people's developing understanding of how to get that nuance correct.
Ali.
I think really an expansion on both of the points that are made, but I'm taking in a slightly different direction. I think the education element also needs to extend to the audience. Digital literacy, media literacy, understanding what it is you're seeing, developing within the audience the critical functions to be able to say, I understand when something is real or likely to be real. I understand where something is likely to be fake, and I need to be more cautious with it. And actually on that, I would observe, having teenage kids myself, that the younger generation are developing that critical understanding. in a way that I don't see necessarily with an older age group.
Yeah.
Who, I mean, I get more conspiracy theories and fake memes from my uncle than I do from my daughter, right? So there is something here about educating people on what the tools are doing and what they're receiving, as well as at the production end how those tools should be used. I think you need both of those to run in tandem.
No, for sure. I mean, Gary, do you have any teachings from your use of AI of things that have gone wrong that might help us to better inform us going forward?
This is the admit to your failings question, Simeon, is it? Lessons. Lesson number one, successful deployment of any AI technology is very, very, perhaps entirely dependent upon humans. That unless your people know what they're doing, it's never going to work. You can't rely on the machine. That if you put rubbish in, you'll get rubbish out. So if we're doing something in data, we need to make sure that the data we put in is clean and correct. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do anything with it. And you can't rely on the machine. You have to check everything. Anything you're planning to put in front of an audience needs to go through a human filter at some point. So you have to build a very secure procedure into working with the machine as you would do in working with colleagues. Just think of it as a colleague who can occasionally be unreliable as well. So you have to have checks and balances in place. You have to design them into your system. You can't just hope that the machine will get things right. Humans are vital.
And when have you seen the machine go spectacularly wrong?
Fortunately, in the technology I use to build the radar business is very constrained. So it's a rule-based system. So it only went wrong if the person setting the rule had set the rule incorrectly. That was a human error. So we have to, which underlines how we have a challenge here in building a whole new skill base as well for people. So I saw a quote the other day from someone who'd worked previously at the Wall Street Journal who said, AI will not replace journalists, but journalists who don't use AI will be replaced. That the idea being that the nature of the job that we do in the media will change because of the tooling that we use, which has always been the case. Let's face this, it's always been the case. It's perhaps moving a lot more rapidly, and it means that there is a constant need for skills refresh and to make sure that people are well equipped and well trained in the tools you are going to ask them to use. So there's a huge training element to getting this right as well.
I mean, on the topic of training, we spoke earlier about the fact that with generative AI, audiences themselves are also going through a process of learning what is real, what is not real. So obviously, when the fake Pope pictures came out of the Pope looking drippy, looking like a Balenciaga advert, when that came out, a lot of people were like, wow, that looks real. And they felt it was real. But now, actually, when they see images that are created by apps like Midjourney, they're more familiar with it if they're plugged into that ecosystem. The question then becomes, though, is that actually somebody called Kate has asked, how do we actually educate audiences? And if we especially consider that the average age of actual television news audiences consuming it in linear form is probably closer to your uncle, Ali, than your children. How does that process take place for those people who are not living on meme pages?
I think part of that, though, is the fact that we've also got editorial teams like yourself who are covering this as stories. And as you say, a lot of linear audiences are those perhaps who are most in need of educating. I mean, just the other week, we had the really difficult story of the DeSantis campaign using some doctored images of Trump with Fauci. And what was really difficult about that was that there was 6 images on a screen. 3 of them were real of Trump with Fauci and 3 of them were doctored. So it was all sort of incorporated in. It wasn't like a kind of Pope standout moment. He's wearing a puffer jacket, which is not something I expect to see. This was far more subtle. So I think part of that is the challenge for how news teams report on AI. And I think, you know, we've had the kind of inevitable sort of flurry of stories over the last couple of weeks because it all feels a bit kind of new and exciting, and let's do an AI story every day. But I think over time, and especially with 2 elections happening next year, AI needs to be seeded into our editorial rather than there being an AI correspondent necessarily, by which I mean we need our political teams to be talking about AI and AI fakeries and how that's impacting on democracy and election campaigns. You know, we need our climate journalists to be talking about how AI is skewing that debate. So I think seeding it through the newsroom is really important. And I think we do have a role to play in educating our audiences in the same way that we try to educate them about a whole host of different subjects.
I mean, the big topic at the moment is obviously regulation, which is a huge area. I mean, AI is so broad, you know, we're talking about patent rights, we're talking about copyright, we're talking about who owns it, we're talking about what it can do, and it's a massive area. I mean, where do you currently stand on regulation from a journalistic perspective? Like, what are the things that you would like to see in that space? That's to everybody, but I'll start with Tammy actually.
Sure. Well, I think one of the big issues, obviously, that we're really interested in, because we own so much data with an archive that dates back to 1955, is the fact that if machines are being taught using our material, we want a license for that in the same way that we would expect a license from anyone who uses our material. I mean, currently we work with Getty both as partners and as clients, and they're involved in a lawsuit against Stability AI, who they claim have used their images to teach their AI. So, you know, we're collaborating with their lawyers, we're talking to them, we're trying to understand how we can have common talking points across the industry in our ask for it. And I think especially going forward, when we move from search to generated chat, the lack of transparency about sources is going to be absolutely crucial, because it could destroy traffic to news sites, which is going to have a really big impact on the financial sustainability of the news organizations. So just for anyone who doesn't quite understand, at the moment, if you want to search what happened in Russia this weekend, if you put that into Google, it will come up with a whole bunch of different stories on different sites, and you can go into the one that you're interested in, and essentially your traffic registers on their site. If you put that into Bard or into ChatGPT, that will simply scrape together a whole bunch of stories from across the internet and give you a 3-line summary. And if all you wanted is a 3-line summary, you might not go further. You also won't know where that 3-line summary has been pulled from, or what the biases are, or what the political weighting has been. So I think in terms of the regulatory bits that we're really concerned about, it's about licensing material and making sure that there's a fair return for that. And it's around news being treated as a special case in terms of transparency of sourcing, and if need be, compensation if material is being scraped.
And so would you say that in terms of, I know that Rachel Corp, our big boss, has obviously written to government, talking about special legal protections for journalists and journalism-based content, journalism. Would you say that those things cover that, or are there further protections that are needed?
Well, I think Rachel's letter was basically kicking this off and putting it on the government's agenda and saying, this is, especially with an election next year, this is a really important issue to be considered for the health of our democracy, and that news organizations, trusted organizations, have a role to play in helping protect what ultimately is a government's aim, which is a healthy democratic process. So her letter really was a starting point to say government needs to be waking up to this and talking to broadcasters about this, but also calling on the broadcasting industry to group together, because it's not something that any of us are going to achieve on our own. I think there will be a strength in numbers argument.
Talking about the broadcast industry, Ali, as the representative of power in that industry. What are some of the things that you're seeing from a regulatory perspective, especially when we consider that one question that we have is that, you know, I mentioned that I was at a AI conference last week. It was based in Amsterdam, and you had people there from the US, people there from the UK, people there from Europe, and these are all very much different, you know, regulatory arenas where a different activity taking place. When some of the, you know, businesses and actors are located outside of the UK, what do you imagine will be some of the regulatory challenges that we're facing in this sector?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This is a global issue, and a UK-centric answer is likely to miss the mark. I'll give you a particular example on this, just working through it a little bit, because I think it does highlight some of the nature of the problems. I can see a really strong case in the UK for us to say AI systems need to be trained on UK data of a journalistic standard that's been subject to editorial control, because we know that is good quality information, and it's been made to a particular set of rules and standards. And frankly, it is better than generic content on the internet that may be used to train those systems. You know, there is a quality to it, and that's good for society. Now, first regulatory question is, the AI developers may not value that content as highly as we think society would. So there's a disconnect there, and someone needs to resolve that difference in valuation. But there are more questions that seed out from that. The remuneration of the platforms is absolutely key. There's a huge question there. Is data scraping fair use? Is it not? Different jurisdictions may well have a different view on that. But also, and I had the great privilege of attending Reuters Fellow Symposium earlier this week, where they had presentations from people who are visiting fellows at the Reuters Institute. And what was clear from that is the nature of journalism worldwide can be very different to what it is in the UK. And they had presentations from people working hugely courageously in really challenging circumstances. So I might say here, I value 1,000 words from Matthew Parris in the Times much more highly than I value someone's blog, made up sitting in their basement. But in other jurisdictions, someone who's risking their life doing citizen journalism hidden in a basement may be massively more valuable than state-controlled media, where in jurisdictions where the press is not free and there isn't a plural media landscape. But what we're trying to do is work with global platforms who are looking for a global set of rules. So there are real challenges that come up with us saying in the UK, you know what, ITN have got fabulous content. You need to reach some kind of commercial deal with them to have that content represented in AI systems. But in another jurisdiction, that would be a disaster. So how do you, as regulators, as international governments and international bodies and so on, start to resolve some of those questions? I don't have answers, but to be honest, what I'm trying to point out is that the question set here is vast, and it's really complicated, and there are huge sensitivities in it. And I don't see that there are simple solutions to any of it.
But some of this isn't a regulatory issue, though, is it? I don't think that you can't regulate to get a company like OpenAI to produce a language model that just looks at UK news. They're not going to do it, or they'd only do it if there was a business sense for doing it. So it may fall to the news organizations to decide that if you want to train such a language model, which may or may not be possible, then that's something that a news organization alone or a group of news organizations together might choose to do. And it's probably a business proposition more than a regulatory proposition at that point. So it's difficult to see how some of this can regulate. And also, we're trying to post-regulate in a way. The horse is out of the stable because those language models are out there. And so it's a compensatory thing now. And yes, there's my understanding is there are conversations ongoing about how companies whose material was used to train the language model should be compensated for such, and how their continuing data would be used by a language model and some form of monetization developed from that. But the monetization, Tammy points out, the potential end of a link into a chat-based search really is a very disruptive threat to the news industry, because it takes away the monetization point, leaving us all to try and find a new one. And no one knows what that might look like yet.
But I think also, I mean, I do think that a lot of these organizations have been able to unleash incredibly powerful tools with almost no safety checks. I mean, frankly, you need to do more safety checks to create a toilet cleaner or a lipstick or anything than unleashing a generative AI model on the public and on children. And we have regulations in place, and we expect companies, especially companies that target products at children, to be doing due diligence and safety checks on their products. And it's frightening that these products have been unleashed without those kind of checks being expected of them. And government does have a track record in asking companies to make sure their products are safe. And I think it has been very remiss that this is all being launched without any safety checks at all.
And so, I guess Gary said that, fundamentally, the horse is bolted, the tools are here. We now find ourselves in a space where there is opportunity, but also considerable risk, especially because we're supposed to be purveyors that people can trust. I mean, has ITN looked at the business opportunities from AI? And are currently, whilst pushing for regulation, are there things that you're looking at as a potential income generator or income source from the opportunities?
I think we're at the beginning of that journey, and I think part of the problem is there are so many applications, and the applications are so wide. As Gary said, a starting point is really hard to find. What we've done at ITN is to try and disseminate this out to the different areas of the business. So we're asking our finance team to look at AI solutions for finance. We're looking at our HR team to look at AI solutions for them. What I think I can do from the top is to provide a framework and discussion points for the different bits of the business, because I think part of the problem is it feels incredibly overwhelming. AI is such a big umbrella term. And I think that when you're looking at business opportunities, it's about starting with your pinch points. As Gary said, either what can your journalist currently not do? What are you currently struggling to do? So it may be that an investigations team is saying, well, we just don't have the resource to go through a massive pile of data to get to the story that we want to get to, or as I say, I can't sit here from the top and work out what everyone needs. So for us, it's about creating structures across the business where people can identify pinch points, look at the tools, and then crucially to have a more kind of senior working group that will then look at each of these applications for sort of the legal ramifications, the IP potential breaches, and can therefore either say, or the security risks to our own systems, and can therefore kind of approve it or not. But definitely at the early stages of it.
Okay, before we kind of go into some of the questions that have been submitted, I just wanted to ask you a bit about what you see being the immediate future for these technologies in the area of news and current affairs. Well, I'm asking you to basically be, Mystic Meg, and effectively tell us what the future is as you see it.
I'll kick off if you want. There's a lot of experimentation going on at the moment, as we've been talking about, to try and find a good starting place, because there are multiple opportunities. A friend of mine said that generative AI was a bit like teenage sex, that apparently everyone's doing it. The actual practical applications of this within a newsroom workflow, and particularly audience-facing outputs, are still quite modest. And that's probably a good thing, because people need to take a step back, have a look at what they've got in front of them, and work out where the best applications are. And that might be in trying to, let's be optimistic. Let's say we can try and make a journalist or a newsroom job a media job easier by giving someone a tool which takes away a really poor value for time job and releases them to do something of higher value, because we can automate away the boring stuff. So let's have a look at how we can automate away the boring stuff. But also, is there something we couldn't do with a human effort alone that the use of a machine tool allows us to now do? So can we develop a better quality of service, a higher scale of service, a completely new service for a new audience? Because we now have the tooling to do it, and it would have been not viable before that. And if you can do that, you might be able to see a new revenue stream and a new way of better serving your audience. And those are surely very good things for any media business, and particularly any news business. So I try to take a quite optimistic view about that. We've spent a lot of time talking about all the risks, and there are many, and we should be wary of them. But there are plenty of opportunities here. We just have to see what the right ones are, and each individual business is the right ones for their use case.
Great.
I think that's all very fair, and I'm with Gary on the optimism, but I think it's the nature of regulators to be quite downbeat about everything. So I think that the thing I'm a little bit more, I guess, wary about or concerned about, actually, it's outside of the regulatory sphere, but this will be a period of change. People's work will change, the nature of the jobs they do will change, and I guess I'm a little bit less confident perhaps than Gary was that the person who used to do that sort of, that task which is now going to be washed away by AI is exactly the same person who could then move on to a new task that is created. The historical analogies, you've got the seed drill and you've got the power loom. Things, the AI could be of that scale in terms of its disruption to the way that we work. And we will see people whose skills are unfortunately now no longer needed, and the new skills will be harder to come by, and in the short term, at least, in short supply. So we're going to see a lot of disruption in every workplace, but the newsroom included. And the way that firms deal with this is actually going to be a really interesting and also quite challenging period for us over the coming years. That I see a lot of disruption, a lot of need for retraining, a lot of need for really careful employment handling.
Great. And Tammy?
Yeah, I don't see, certainly at ITN, that this is going to impact on our sort of public-facing journalism in the short term. I think that the changes initially are going to be far more sort of back-end and around working practices. But I do think it's going to actually make people really look at their working practices in a new way, because if you have a tool, even if you're not using that tool, but if you're aware that a tool can do something that you're currently doing and do it faster and potentially better, that's going to make you question whether it's a good use of your time doing it. And so I really hope actually that staff will feel empowered to question what they're doing, to question whether the tools they're using are right, to question whether there are better ways that they're doing it. I think the challenge for organizations is to ensure that really positive energy and positive creativity is properly directed and is kind of safely administered, so that we use it to good rather than people going rogue.
Great.
That's the main takeaway, by the way, from the ITN guidelines is don't go rogue.
Don't go rogue.
Don't go rogue.
Once upon a time, Google's catchphrase was "Don't do evil," and it's great. So
but we intend to actually live by this, Simeon.
All right. Okay. Well, I mean, I've got some direct questions that have come through. To Ali. So we mentioned earlier that Rachel had written to government, Rachel Corp, the CEO of ITN, asking for special journalistic kind of protections in the age of AI. Is that something that you agree with and support?
Sorry, my apologies. I haven't kept up with the letter, and I will go and look for the public version. Journalistic content is different. Let's be clear. It has a more direct effect on our perceptions of the world and our behavior than other forms of content. You can't compare it to a piece of music or a novel or other forms of content that are out there. It's also really interesting because it's typically any individual piece of journalistic content is ephemeral. It has a time value that sort of expires really quickly, and then you need to replace it with the next one. So there's lots of things that make journalistic content different. I would argue that yes, because of the way that it impacts the way our democracy functions, the way that we perceive society, the way that we understand, what our values and mores are, journalistic content is different. What that difference means that we should do with it, well, I think there's a broader conversation to have. But do you need to think about it in a separate category and approach it in a different way? I would agree. Yes, you do.
Another question that came through, which is something that everybody has been talking about in the open information movement, is, if companies like Alphabet and Microsoft start charging subscriptions for their generative AIs, will we need some form of public service internet, or will we need to see some kind of levy attached to their use from the fact that they've trained this software on ultimately all of our content in the commons, in the public arena? So do we need some form of public service internet, or do these private companies need to now have a public service agreement or payment plan? Gary, Tammy?
A public service, there's I think there's a government task force set up to decide whether there needs to be a national based language model, which I suppose would be the starting framework for that. I think, doesn't the Prime Minister call it ChatGPT? So whether there's a value in each nation state having its own language model to serve the purposes for its citizens. That may or may not happen. It requires a huge amount of investment and work and speed of foot at the moment, so that may not happen. Whether there needs to be some sort of settlement across data usage, I think there probably does. And whether that could be an ongoing business framework, it probably does. And whether the tools we're using at low cost now will suddenly become slightly more expensive, I think that's probably inevitable in the way these things develop. So there's a lot of economic decision making to take place, and one of the risks for any media business is getting involved and building your service around a tool set which then becomes unaffordable for you 2 years down the pike. So it's these are difficult business decisions for any organization to take.
Can I just come in on that for you, if you don't mind, Simeon? I must admit, I wouldn't put Microsoft and Google in my immediate worry set, for the reason that over a period of time, and it will be hard work, they will come under a set of regulatory rules and toolkits and legislation and so on. These are the big companies that we can see and touch, and there are executives that can be held to account, and there are laws we can make them follow. It will be hard. But the analogy I'd give you is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. You can get nation states to sign up to those kind of treaties, and I would put Microsoft and Google in that category now. The people we really need to worry about are the bad actors with the dirty bomb, whose AI is good enough to create something that is disruptive, or who can create a deep fake of something that sort of changes the way that we think about a particular subject. Those are where I think the ability to actually control that behavior is, I think, more of a worry than Google and Microsoft's pricing, because we will be able to put some kind of regulatory wrap around that.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I think my worry really just is about the time lag that this is going to take. I mean, we still don't have legislation on the books to cover social media, and we're 20 years on from that. The Digital Media Bill is still going through Parliament. The chances of us having, proper AI legislation quickly, I think, is sadly, that's the bit I worry about, is the time lag. But I mean, I was just reading today, in Denmark, they're introducing a cultural tax on streamers, basically to sort of put money back into the Danish cultural economy. And you could envisage a sort of situation like that, where there is a sort of a levy that is placed on these companies that could compensate, you know, be it news or production or artistic industries in the countries where they're essentially scraping and benefiting from. Obviously, a lot of detail to be worked out on that, but it's, you know, we do see in the same way that Canada has moved forward with, you know, charging social media platforms for news, and the same in Australia. Perhaps what we're going to do is take the models that are just starting to be applied for social media and speed those up to use them for AI.
Okay,
But that's
great.
one for you, Ali.
And I guess I've got a final question, mainly for Ali and Tammy, is that the cultural biases in AI have been quite well documented. I mean, does any AI policy effectively require an equalities policy to go along with it to ensure, you know, protections for minorities, and also to recognize that there is a bias in the way that AI comes to generate and see the world? So it sees the world through a very particular lens that newsrooms have been under pressure to shift. And so, is there an equalities policy that goes along with our AI policies?
I absolutely see this risk, and I think it is really, really important. The broadcast sector has made huge strides on diversity, on screen, off screen. Lots of work to do. I'm not complacent about it. Yeah, we take that really seriously. But if you look at how far we've come, I think there is real credit for people involved in the progress that's been made. But if you look at the stock of text, images, whatever it is that have been used to train AI, we know that, you know, ethnic groups, people of, you know, certain identities and so on, are going to be underrepresented in that, or that the text will contain tropes about them, or, you know, that kind of bias and leaning will be built in. And so for those people using AI tools, you kind of need to understand what's in there to understand what's going to happen when you generate an output. And today, you know, that stock of information that's gone in will be rife with, you know, homophobia or racist tropes and all of those kind of things, which will find their way into the output unless you are really vigilant. But what I would say is the Equalities Act exists. The fact is, it still applies whether or not you're using AI. So for everyone who is using these tools, you've got to understand what your responsibilities are under the law. You're not relieved from those responsibilities because you used a tool which you didn't understand properly. That's not good enough. So the investment everybody needs to make in their ability to understand the tools is really significant. And I see that as going to be a challenge, because the number of people who really get it, who understand the tools, you know, there's not that many Garys out there that you can hire to tell you what's going on.
Okay. And very briefly, Tammy, because we have to leave.
Well, I think this once again is the education thing, and it's that AI is not a tech issue, and that we need diversity people, you know, diversity officers or diverse workforces more than we've ever needed them before. I would say that there are things that we can do that are quite practical. So, for example, obviously, we're dealing with a flawed past, which will be embedded in the data that is coming out. But we can teach our staff about better prompting, that if we are aware of the biases, you know, you can prompt in such a way that the outcomes are likely to be less biased or more diverse. And that forces you to kind of think about it in a very real way. So, you know, the example that Marcus Ryder had given about asking ChatGPT for the top 20 actors and them all being white Hollywood stars and no representation from Bollywood or Asia or anywhere else. If the prompt had said, I want top 20 actors from the 20th century, including actors from Bollywood and China and you would have got a different response. And so I think educating staff about the fact that prompt is not neutral, that they can ask in such a way that the results are actually better or more diverse, that's part of our educating staff.
Great. Well, first and foremost, can I thank you all for joining us, and to everybody else who kind of shared their lunchtime with us. I hope you managed to get the rest of the sunshine that I've seen out. And yeah, I think fundamentally this is a huge area. It's hugely disruptive, especially from a purely business perspective anyway, in terms of the ownership that it disrupts and who owns ideas. We've obviously seen the writers' strike take place in Hollywood around very much the ownership as well as much pay that comes from the use of some of these softwares. So, I mean, it's going to be a huge area. In the work that I'm covering, seeing people's voices become cloned, and they're now trying to fight back and question what rights they have. And so as a regulatory kind of area, it's going to be one that the conversation, let alone the policy, is going to be going on and on and on. So thanks a lot for helping us to make sense of it in this sector. If you're watching this and you want to understand more about AI, do watch Channel 4's series. Thanks to the organizers as well from RTS and from IT and Public Affairs team, Bally and everybody. So yeah, thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, man, hopefully we're all here and AI doesn't, not only take our jobs, but our lives too, if you believe those headlines. But take it easy. Thanks a lot.